You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets on Media Network.
Good morning, Arizona, and welcome to our guests from around the planet, around the globe. My name is Joe Brett.
And this is David Lucier.
And you're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We have a wonderful show for you today and a great guest. And we're so thankful that Mark could join us. And before David introduces him, I just want to tip that next week we have a gentleman by the name of Zach Bazzi who will be calling in from Kurdistan. Zach was a former soldier with the 101st Airborne Division in the Iraq War, and he's since with his colleagues formed an organization called Tent Ed, and they provide tents and educational materials for refugee kids in Syria. And he's teaching now in Kurdistan, and he'll be calling in and give us an update from the front, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
That would see wherever the front is these days, but that's certainly one of them.
It's tended to move over the course of the last few months.
And it is moving rapidly. And anyway, we're looking forward to having Zach on the show. And so, David, why don't you introduce your friend, Mark?
Well, this morning, we are really honored and excited to have Dr. Mark Von Hagen with us this morning. And I think probably Mark is, I would call him the leading expert in the country today as far as Russian history is concerned. He's got a wealth of knowledge in that area. And of course, they're along with a wealth of knowledge about the Ukrainian-Russian relationship, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But Mark currently is the director of the Office of Veterans and Military Academic Engagement at Arizona State University's Tempe campus. And I've been privileged to sit in on a couple of his classrooms, class lectures, and they're absolutely fascinating. You couldn't find a fellow who's more veteran supportive than Mark. And in fact, he knows a whole lot about Russian veterans as well. And we'll get in a little bit, get into that a little bit. To see some of these commonalities amongst veterans, no matter who they are, what country they're from, there's some commonality there. But Mark just brings, like I say, a wealth of knowledge in this area. And so I'd like to welcome Mark Von Hagen, Dr. Mark Von Hagen, here to the studio with us today. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Joe, and good morning, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to having a chance to talk about what I've been doing the last few years.
A few years, for many years.
Why don't we start at the beginning? Give us a little backgrounder here. Where are you from? Where were you raised, and how did you get into the type of work that you're doing now?
Well, like I say, you mentioned I'm a specialist on Russia and Ukraine, and actually I wrote my first book on the Soviet Army in the 1920s. And it probably comes from my upbringing as a son of a veteran. My father started in the Army in counterintelligence after World War II in Vienna as part of the American occupation there, where I met my mother, who was an Austrian. And then he got out and then got back in again and served the rest of his 20 years in the Air Force in Strategic Air Command Intelligence. So I've been living with the enemy sort of through him.
Sure.
And then when I went to school, I became a Russian historian, so I got to know the enemy my own way, and the Soviet Army on top of that. So
where did you go to school, Mark?
I went to Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C., and then I got an MA in Indiana University in Slavic Language and Literature, and then I finished my education I finished my formal education with the PhD in History and Humanities at Stanford, where I wrote about the Red Army.
So, Georgetown is one of the premier universities for the Foreign Service.
And I was going to go into the Foreign Service, but it was during the Nixon administration, and I met too many diplomats who were not happy being diplomats then, and I figured I could be a diplomat as an academic too, and so
Why was that during the Nixon administration? They weren't happy diplomats.
There was Vietnam, and there was the Cold War, and there was Kissinger, and everyone I knew in the State Department, and Georgetown was very good about getting us to meet people in the State Department, and as I'm sure they are today. the ones who I admired, who knew stuff about the parts of the world, they were very unhappy under Nixon and Kissinger, because Kissinger didn't basically pay attention to the State Department. He was running things on his own. And the ones who seemed to like their job were ones who I thought could talk out of 5 sides of their mouth and with equal conviction. I thought, I don't know if that was me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, academics are not without that kind of too, but I think
Was there a thought in academia back in the Nixon time that the war in Vietnam was what it turned out to be, a failed operation?
Oh, definitely.
The academics knew at the time.
Well, and even at a school like Georgetown, which is a Jesuit Catholic university, there were priests like the Dryden brothers who were often on campus, organizing anti-war protests, marches against the U.S. supporting Latin American police states, and because it was a kind of training center for Latin American police and army somewhere in Georgetown that we also protested against during that time. And, it was Cambodia, it was Kent State, all that stuff that, affected almost every university, but especially in Washington, you couldn't avoid it. It was Watergate. I mean, I was studying Russian, second year Russian during the summer of Watergate. So it was kind of everything coming together made me think I should go do something else. And I say, as a son of a veteran, I grew up in foreign countries and started learning foreign languages in France, where my father had his second assignment after I was born. I was born in Ohio. And I supposedly spoke good French as a nursery school kid, but had to go study it again later. Then we moved to Florida just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we moved to Germany, and I studied music with a German teacher. And then my first Russian teacher was also an Air Force veteran, a friend of the family. And my college Russian teacher was an Air Force veteran named Robert Lager, who sort of left indelible marks in my psyche afterwards. But I've been taught by veterans, starting with my father. So I kind of think in some ways I'm continuing their educational mission, but without being a veteran. But I have become a historian of wars and militaries. And that's what I teach now at ASU. I teach Soviet history, obviously, every year. And I teach the history of the Eastern Front in World War I and World War II. And most recently, I've been teaching a course on oral history with veterans, in which I get veteran students and non-veteran students to get to know each other by reading books about war and the veteran experience, and having all of the students do an oral history with a veteran as their final assignment. And it's been a wonderful experience, and kind of got me into this bigger project of the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement, which is about listening to veteran stories. And, we started out this interview, hearing about your stories and you sharing stories with each other that you didn't know. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're listening to veterans. We're connecting them with people inside and outside academia who we think share their interests and might benefit from their expertise and knowledge, and then connect and learning from them. And the most exciting experience, I taught this course this past semester called Wartime Occupations and Colonial Wars. And it was starting with our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but going all the way back to the British in Afghanistan, the Soviets in Afghanistan, us in Vietnam, the French in Vietnam. And I had about a third veterans in the class, mostly Army and Marine veterans. And they really added a dimension. I mean, I was able to let them be teachers with me, co-instructors, because they could talk about counterinsurgency and search and cordon operations, and that I don't have that kind of street cred.
Yeah.
But the veterans in the class of these recent wars are great teachers, and that's what I'm trying to create environments and fora where veterans can share their stories and expertise, and that way, and find faculty members who are interested in hearing those stories and learning about the veteran experience, and helping veterans succeed at ASU as best we can.
That basic focus of trying to connect the veterans and the non-veteran world, or the civilian and the military worlds, is hugely important. And that's one of the things one of the reasons I'm so fascinated with the work that you're doing, is that's exactly what's happening. And the Veterans Heritage Project, where we're connecting young scholars and veterans. It's connecting those two communities that'll have a positive and lasting impact as to who we are and where we're going as a country, as a community.
And I say, growing up as a son of a World War II and Cold War veteran, I was used to thinking that everyone had this kind of experience in their families, but recently, as we all know, only 1% of our population is fighting these endless wars that we seem to send our men and women to fight. And the rest of the 99%, I think, would rather not think about it most of the time, but don't know how to think about it properly. They don't know how to talk to veterans when they come back about their experiences. They don't know how to think about war. And I think that's been a kind of abdication of responsibility on the part of education. And it's a serious problem for democracy if we don't have people who know why we're sending people and what it's doing to them.
Absolutely. And one of the things I've sort of, come across, and I've sort of been proselytizing about, is the fact that, veterans can't let people off the hook by just saying, well, you weren't there, so you wouldn't understand. And the civilians basically saying, oh, gee, I can't imagine what you went through.
Yeah.
We got to get past that gap.
Yeah.
And we got to get civilians to imagine, and we've got to get veterans to talk about their experience so that both become teachers from the perspective of their communities.
And I think we have a lot of educating to do in academia about wars and veterans,
Yes.
because most faculty are not used to dealing with non-traditional students. They have a certain model, or if they do have an idea of non-traditional students as students with disabilities or some other kind of issue. And so we're trying also to educate fellow faculty and staff about what a veteran population involves. And, of course, first of all, they're very diverse, very diverse people. and we're trying to get that message across that the more we can do to appeal to veterans' different interests and backgrounds, the better we can. And that's something, of course, is good for all students, but
Sure.
but especially true, I think, for veterans who have kind of this unique experience. And so I think we that's part of our educational mission too. Is
Well,
to
and
try to,
Arizona State University has been an absolute leader in encouraging veterans.
Yes,
so I
they've been a
know
great leader.
in just over 4 years, they've more than quadrupled the number of veterans in their institution, and that's in large part due to the leadership of the university and the people who are involving themselves and making a concerted effort to do exactly what you're doing today.
So are you involved with the New America Foundation? You're part of that. Can
Yeah.
you explain a little bit because I think that is Michael Crow's,
Mhm.
a gift to veterans of the community in a way
Michael Crow being the president of Arizona State University for
to accept-
our listeners across the globe.
to educate and to draw in a national, dialogue on veterans. David and I are tearing our hair out. We seem to be sending our sons and daughters off to these wars that are not winnable, but I don't hear mention about the veteran or the soldier in the first instance, when these policies are being made. What impact will it have on the lives? What are the casualties? What are we thinking? Because someone has had to have had these conversations. Yes, we're going to go to Iraq. What's the casualty rate? It'll be light. Well, someone's writing off. Someone's not thinking clearly or protectively, I guess, about our treasured sons and daughters. And so I think New America is the way into that. Would you agree, Doctor?
Well, that's still very new. There's a Center on the Future of Wars, it's called now, and it's about thinking about, again, having us think as academics with people in Washington and elsewhere around the world about where war is headed and what it means for us as a democracy and how we can prepare ourselves, both as civilians and future military people and veterans, for those kind of conflicts. So, and we're actually starting to work on a new master's degree in strategy with some of the veteran faculty. Brad Allenby, an engineering colleague of mine, who's just written this piece on civilizational conflict about cyber threats and all kinds of new emerging technologies that are part of the modern war scene. So there's a lot of room for, I think, discussions in academia that maybe couldn't happen in the Pentagon or happen in a different way in the Pentagon, that we can encourage in academia. institutions and like the branches of the military. It's a foreign culture for most Americans, citizens. So it's a matter of learning from each other. And again, Steve Borden is trying to learn the civilian academic culture that I supposedly am an expert in, and we're trying to learn about the military culture from him that he's an expert in. And that's an example of what we're trying to do, trying to educate people about these two cultures who don't seem to communicate well enough with each other and lead to a lot of misunderstandings.
Sure.
When you don't understand each other, you have a lot of
If you
misunderstandings.
don't speak the same language, it's a little difficult to understand each other.
Yeah. So that's
Fantastic.
kind of how, I see the Center on the Future of War fitting into that too, kind of
Now,
a
there is-
discussion. But the other thing, we're doing a lot of stuff with the arts and humanities, especially allowing veterans to communicate whatever their experience is through theater, through writing, through poetry, through music. And one of our more exciting things upcoming is a ceramics show with the potter, a Marine veteran potter who's coming to do a residency at our art museum. And we're going to do sessions at the VA center and maybe some veterans transitional home housing shelters for getting veterans into pottery and cup making. And so we're doing the nursing school, the Veterans Administration, and our office in Herberger. And it's kind of an amazing collaboration, which we hope is a model for getting arts and therapy and veterans expressing themselves in ways that maybe.
Does the student body in the whole, do they want to participate in that? Is it mostly for veterans and those are kind of close to the veterans?
There are a lot of students who I think are curious but don't know where to turn a lot of times. So I'm hoping to provide more opportunities there. But there are a lot of students who have brothers or sisters or cousins or uncles who've served. And an example, there's a woman who just did a senior honors thesis with me, Chloe Westland, and she she's a veteran of my first oral history class or second oral history class, and she admits that she got the bug doing oral histories with veterans and she really liked it. So she asked me if she could do a senior thesis project with a few veterans, and she interviewed 3 women and 1 man, 3 Marines and 1 Army veteran, and she just was amazing. But seeing her grow through this experience as a civilian was a gift to me, to see her. She did a lot of research on each veteran. She made sure she was very sensitive to what their story was, and it's just a wonderful experience of how a civilian who she had an uncle who served in Vietnam, and that was her main connection from high school. But this was someone who's a global studies history major, and was just a nice girl from the local area who got very interested in veterans and did these amazing interviews.
We have David and I, we're with the Veterans Heritage Project, and our founder, Barbara Hatch, the Peace Corps volunteer, who started this program. It's Cactus Shadows High School. But I think David and I are overwhelmed by seeing the impact of the students who interview veterans. It's remarkable. It's transformational.
It is for me too.
And we're going to have students on,
It's
and it is for us.
transformational to not only the student or the young scholar, but also the veteran.
Right.
It's amazing.
And he or she has never probably told his or her story completely at one time. And here it is all at once in a book that they can keep for a lifetime. And the families are telling us that they never knew that about their dad or their brother or their uncle.
No, I had a similar experience with my own father a couple of years ago, just before my mother died, which was very good that we did it before my mother died. My nephew all of a sudden wanted got interested in my father's military career. And so I said, well, I'm going to do an oral history next time I come home to visit. And so we sat for 3 hours with my dad, who's 90 years old, who could remember things better than I can remember. And he said no one had ever sat down and asked him that. And my nephew was like wide-eyed and just dropping.
Well, we're going to pick that up when we come back. We're going to be back in about 2 or 3 minutes. You're listening to Veterans Heritage Hour, and we have with us today Professor Mark Von Hagen from Arizona State University. Thank you.
Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in their life. I'm no different. Hey, everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury doing, that'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552 or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. Don't forget Tom.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertising.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face to face. To find the nearest career to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
Veterans served us, now it's time we serve them. As a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a current military member deployed abroad, I would like to take a minute of your time to tell you about Patriot Hills of New York. Patriot Hills of New York is a nonprofit organization providing support to veterans and their families. They partner veterans in need with over 65 health and wellness organizations, community groups, as well as philanthropic foundations providing low-cost services. Over 400 veterans through confidential referral services, assistance with veterans issues, employment placement, as well as educational opportunities. If you need assistance or just want to help veterans by donating your time or services, contact them at info@patriothills.org. Again, that's info@patriothills.org. Visit patriothillsnewyork.com for more information about their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help. Veterans served us, and now it's time we serve them. As a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as a current military member deployed abroad, I would like to take a minute of your time to tell you about Patriot Hills of New York. Patriot Hills of New York is a nonprofit organization providing support to veterans and their families. They partner veterans in need with over 65 health and wellness organizations, community groups, as well as philanthropic foundations providing no or low-cost services. They've helped over 400 veterans through confidential referral services, assistance with veterans issues, employment, as well as educational opportunities. If you need assistance or just want to help veterans by donating your time or services, contact them at info@patriothills.org. Again, that's info@patriothills.org. Visit patriothillsnewyork.com for more information about their services or how you can donate. Our veterans deserve no less. We can give it to them, and you can help. Everyone's going to need an attorney at some point in life. I'm no different. Hey everyone, it's James from Vets On. Whether it was my last will and testament before deployment or my ongoing custody battle for my children during my divorce, I needed help, so I lawyered up. If you need help, I urge you to contact Capstrom Law Firm. Capstrom Law Firm in Springfield, Missouri services clients throughout the state in criminal law, personal injury, and family law. With over 13 years practicing law, Tom Capstrom understands both law and court procedures and how stressful it can be. Let Tom Capstrom Law Firm, his dedicated staff, take the stress and worry out of a difficult situation by calling in today. We feel so strong about the work that Tom and his staff are doing, it'll be a monthly guest on the show. Tom is a veteran and a listener, for God's sake, so you know the guy is solid and will fight for you. Give Tom a call today by calling 417-864-0552. or email Tom at capstromlaw.com. And don't forget to tell him that Vets On sent you.
The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based upon advertising.
If you or someone you know is looking for a new job or career, you need to visit the pros. National Career Fairs at ncfairs.com. National Career Fairs hosts over 300 career fairs a year nationwide. The events are free and give you the perfect chance to meet some of the top employers in your area face to face. To find the nearest career fair to you, visit ncfairs.com. Again, that's ncfairs.com. What are you waiting for?
You're listening to the Veterans Heritage Hour on the Vets On Media Network.
Hey, we're back with the Veterans Heritage Hour and Professor Mark Von Hagen from Arizona State University. Professor, we were just talking about engagement with the students and your role in bringing oral history into the fore. And David and I, of course, we're involved with the Veterans Heritage Project, and we've seen the transformational aspects of this for students and veterans, and you also are noticing that now. And I can't believe, I've been a veteran now for 45 years, but I can't remember a time in my life as a kid when I didn't look up to soldiers and veterans. There's always been something there for me. And it still is today. I look at a veteran or somebody and I go, wow, I'm still overwhelmed by them. And to this day, it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think anyway, for me.
Well, I like I say, I grew up with veterans, and I looked up to them as my fathers, my godfathers in some cases, and uncles. But more recently, I just want to tell you a story about a couple of my current veteran students.
Sure.
One is a Russian American who, again, I was interested in because of my Russian background. His family left when he was a little kid, so he grew up an American, but in a Russian-speaking family. And he graduated from West Point, and then went off to serve in Iraq. And 5 years ago, when relations with Russia were much better, the United States sent a delegation to the May 9th Victory Day parade under Putin. And he was one of the leaders of his unit that went back because they had taken part in the Battle of the Bulge, I think, or maybe the Normandy invasion. Mm-hmm. So that unit was sent to represent the American contribution and he said his great-grandfather had died in the Red Army around Smolensk. So it was kind of strange for him as a Russian American to be there, feeling very American, but also having this kind of dual loyalty. And I asked him to write that up, and he wrote a very nice piece for May 9th Victory Day, talking about how things have changed in the last 5 years, and we couldn't imagine an American military representation in Moscow these days. But another student, John Lupke, is a Marine veteran, and he did tours in Afghanistan and Helmand province, and he introduced us to his Afghan interpreter, Fahim Fazli, who wrote his memoir and is a Hollywood actor, bit actor these days, and came to class thanks to John, and added again a whole dimension to the class and to ASU students. About the importance of language and how these wars, foreign wars, are somehow better fought if we kind of can talk to the people we're occupying and killing and trying to recruit
in their language.
In their language, and he's he got a very inspirational story. He fled Soviet-occupied Afghanistan to come through. He went through Pakistan, the refugee camps, and then came to the U.S. and went back. And John, as another one, I had a kind of a bad day in the office not too long ago with one of my bosses, and feeling beaten up and humiliated. And I had my office hours, and John came in and showed me some videos from his Afghan experience that he'd taken, and all of a sudden everything kind of found its right place in the world. I said, okay, you guys have serious issues that you've dealt with. My little fight with my boss is nothing. So I even have veteran therapists now, veteran student therapists.
Thanks to you, we had Fahim Fazli and Mike Moffat, his co-author, on the show, and we were there to hear him. So thank you, Mark. You've been a great, great friend to the Veterans Heritage Project and to David and I.
Earlier on, Mark, you'd talked in terms of war and warfare, but you also talked in terms of conflict. And it seems to me that maybe conflict is not war, and war may not be the only conflict. Can you expand on that and talk about
this is something that I haven't thought about an awful lot in my career, but thanks to Comrade Putin over in Russia and my expertise in Ukraine now, people are trying to figure out what Putin is doing in Ukraine and with Ukraine. And there's one word going around called hybrid warfare. There's also new generation warfare. But there's something obviously going on that we're not used to thinking about in our sort of normal strategic West Point Clausewitzian terms. And it involves economic warfare, it involves propaganda warfare, it involves psychology, information warfare, cyber warfare, and almost everything up to but not including conventional armies facing each other. So what Putin's got, these covert people in East Ukraine trying to find allies who are disgruntled with the Ukrainian government, something that goes back to the beginning of the Bolshevik state back in 1917, 18, I think. They were, trying everything they could because they were a weak power vis-a-vis the West, even back then. So they resorted to everything: propaganda, economic warfare, blackmail, espionage, counterterrorism, terrorism, and I think that's what we're facing now. And it's not, and we're not declaring war on these people. And no one's declared war. Putin's never declared war on Ukraine or even on Crimea, which he took.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to think about conflict and how America and the West, prepares for conflict and best responds to challenges in the world. And that's why war seems less satisfying as a way of thinking about this than conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems to me that each of these areas represent boundaries. And so you've got economic boundaries, you've got military boundaries, you've got political boundaries, racial boundaries, religious boundaries, economic boundaries. I mean, you could go on and on and on, but each one of those boundaries represents the potential for conflict. And not the standard response may not get you to where you need to go as far as outcome.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit more complex.
And you can't kill your way out of the situation.
Right.
Killing more
Yeah.
people will not lead to any type of a victory. So
Right.
so that warfare type thing of bombing and all of the mass destruction is not really a viable weapon, because you're trying to kill an ideal or a movement or a thought process or something.
And this we learned a lot from counterinsurgency.
Sure.
I mean, having relearned, every country seems to need to relearn counterinsurgency all the time. When the Soviets had to relearn it in Afghanistan, because they were still fighting World War II at the beginning of the Afghan conflict. We were fighting World War II in Vietnam and had to relearn it, and didn't apparently learn it enough to remember it by the time we got to Afghanistan and Iraq. So we had to relearn it again. So counterinsurgency is sort of that, and counterinsurgency, the most recent variant of it, stresses the population, sort of taking care of the population rather than killing the enemy.
Sure.
And so that's makes what the military does kind of armed humanitarianism. And that's why I had another student who was fascinated with Somalia, and he gave a paper about Mogadishu and the Black Hawk Down, sort of background to Black Hawk Down. And he's an Army veteran, and he was able to look at the oral history the guys on the American side who fought in the Mogadishu battle, but also in the jihadists. He was able to tell the stories from both sides with
Sure.
a lot of convincing persuasion, and a lot of the veterans came up after the class and patted him on the back and told him, "Good job." So there's a lot of that going on, and what we were talking about in that course was how all the boundaries are being broken down. The economic boundary. What's the boundary between war and crime? When you've got ISIS making money on illegal drugs, on illegal arms, on illegal humans shipments. So crime, and even Mexican, we had one presentation by a veteran about the Mexican drug wars and the cartels, and how both the U.S. and Mexico had been militarizing their fight against drugs.
So Jessica Stern is a friend of mine. She was the director of terrorism, I think, in the office in Clinton's White House. She was a PhD candidate at the Kennedy School when I was going through. Anyway, she explained that there's a nexus between the drug cartels and the terrorists, and they were meeting in the jungles of South America to cut up deals of who gets the money and how they're gonna use drugs to profit. Different political terroristic fronts.
And even refugee camps have become major sources of supplies for these, because you get Syrian
Kenya,
refugee
it
camps.
just happened in Kenya, right? The refugee camps spilled into
So even the refugee camps have become part of this political economy of war that allows these ISIS and all these things to survive.
Well, there was a Fahim Zakaria, who's an advisor to the New America Foundation. He had a special on talking about a prison camp in Iraq, where we had all these tribal people, and we had 20,000 of them in a camp, right? Mostly Sunnis. Well, they were there, was like an education program for them, and they created ISIS in that camp under our supervision as a retaliation against us and the Shiites.
Yeah.
Kind of like MS-13 organizing in our prison system.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know where those gangs are down in Texas, but some people are alluding that they came out of prisons and have some.
One of the things we're trying to do with this new MA that we're designing for strategic studies, or whatever we're going to call it, I'm not quite sure, is emphasize, again, this sort of multi-pronged aspect of conflict today. So you need people who, the military, and understand the different branches of the military, because all of these operations have to be joint branch now.
Sure.
They have to be with allies, so they have to be inter-allied. We have to learn something about the histories of the British Army or this Australian Army or the Russian Army sometimes. they have to be able to function with State Department and other civilian agencies who are going to go and do the AID work and and then NGOs, so, plus international law and the media sort of compounding the complex. So the challenge of being a soldier today and most of the conflicts that we're facing is something that I don't think we've ever faced before.
No.
You have to be kind of an armed humanitarian. You have to be an armed social worker. And
With the technological skills to understand all the weaponry and all the.
And I
all
don't
the
think
gadgets.
any school is preparing anybody for this.
The
kind of-
nomenclature of the social media as a weapon
In itself.
Anti-terror environment.
Yeah.
So
That's huge.
in reading the one of the guests that Daniel Rothenberg had, and I'm blocking on his name, but he wrote the book on cyber warfare, is that corporate America, those people who are building the weapon systems, their systems were compromised. So the Chinese were able to get into the corporations to copy the F-35, right, fighter. And so all the codes that were written to make the airplane fly and to make it secure were compromised. And so there was a cost overrun because they had to rewrite all the codes. And so corporate America now has to get involved in this link. And Koreans, when they did a cyber attack against the movie studio, we went cyber attack
And then
against
the
4 or
final
5.
piece is the Congress has to somehow get involved one of these
Congress.
days. And they are part
Congress,
of our,
come on.
our
What's
government.
going on there?
And that's, that's another, no matter how many brilliant minds we have thinking about what we should be doing in the world, if Congress won't come to do its part of supporting those efforts, then, that won't be any good. So if we don't get over our dysfunctional American political system, that's
But
another challenge of this kind of hybrid war.
The thing, I think, an issue in which David and I, again, tear our hair out is that we see this dysfunctional Congress, who let a VA fall apart through complications, who have sent kids into war by a raise of the hand on some premise or ideology or something, and they're all wondering about getting reelected. No one stands up for the veteran, and David and I are trying to suggest that if veterans don't stand up and to make sure that soldiers in future wars are not accounted for in the first instance, rather than as afterthoughts when they come back home, we're in trouble.
We really do have to look at the life cycle of the participants,
Right.
not just how do we recruit them, use them, and then say goodbye to them, but really they're the life cycle of what you've created and how they participate. And just because they come home, a lot of time their participation doesn't end, as we've all found out, and we all know through the Vietnam War and all the things that go on there.
So that means this
is one of
that's why the engagement that you're doing is so
one
important.
of the people I wanted to talk about was Joanna Sweat, who's a military advocate, a Marine Corps veteran, and she did one of these oral histories with Chloe.
And she was on our show too.
And she says, she said, why is it that our society can put so much investment into preparing us to go to war and learn how to kill, but nothing to help us unlearn that?
Because there's no contractors on the other side of this
making
thing.
money on it.
Making money on it.
So that's kind of, I guess, what
Except for a private university, right, that wants to take your money and flunk you out and keep the money. That seems to be a pattern, right?
Hey, let's turn the conversation just slightly about what's going on today in Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, that's not only a conflict area, but obviously a one that may have significant impact across the globe. Can you give us a little background on that relationship and bring us up to date on what's going on and where you think this thing is going?
Well, Russia and Ukraine have been entangled with each other for centuries, and there are neighbors, and they've had different positions as neighbors over the centuries, but they are part of Europe and Eastern Europe, and I think the way I understand what's happening is that Putin has basically become a bully. Started with his own people, cutting down on democracy, and I was in the Soviet Union and Russia, through the 80s and the 90s, so I saw, I think, the peak of Russian democracy, probably late Gorbachev, early Yeltsin years, and then after that, kind of a contraction and diminishing of democracy, but taking a big leap when Putin took over, and taking an even bigger leap the last few years since the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which I think scared Putin and his entourage and the oligarchs and the kleptocrats who run the country. into realizing that if European Western standards of business and politics were ever to make their way to Russia, they would all lose power. So I think that's the basis of what the problem is. Ukraine is a post-Soviet state and a not very prosperous and not very well-run post-Soviet state. Its elites are all former communists and oligarchs themselves, so they are, under some pressure from their population to do something different than what's been done in the past, but the temptations are still very great there. Ukraine is as old as Russia in its current form. They both are products of 1991. And again, 1991 was a very hastily arranged divorce of the Soviet republics into independent states. A lot of issues were left unresolved. Already back in 1991, Yeltsin was threatening the Ukrainians over Crimea, that if they didn't go along with his plan for Russian domination in the post-Soviet arena, then Crimea would be lost to them. So this is not just
Crimea is what portion of the Ukraine?
It's a peninsula on the southern side of Ukraine that's this Black Sea port, and that's where the Russian and Ukrainian navies have their Black Sea headquarters. So, and that was I was okay for the last 25 years, and then and again, the last 25 years there was a lot of hope after the end of communism that somehow people would get along better and that they would all integrate into Europe. And that just broke down the last few years over the Russian-Ukrainian relationship. But it's not just about Russia-Ukraine. The Baltic states are worried about Russian incursions, naval and airspace incursions, kidnapping of Estonian citizens. The Finns and the Swedes are now worried about the Russians' increased military aggressiveness on their borders. The Poles are probably the best friends of Ukrainians. They see what Putin is doing in Ukraine as a threat to them and to all of what they've achieved in Eastern Europe. So it's not just the Ukrainian-Russian thing. The problem is we and the Europeans don't know how to deal with Putin because there are too many divided interests. The Germans kind of blow hot and cold on whether they support the Ukrainians against Putin or whether they are more interested in keeping business with Russians. So it's a very complicated relationship for the Europeans. And we kind of have subcontracted that out to the Germans and the French for the time being until last week when Kerry finally went back to talk to Putin, and not a terribly successful outcome there either. So I think, we are abandoning Ukraine to Russia, which obviously has a much bigger military force than the Ukrainians could ever muster, even if they had help from the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Estonians and the Moldovans and the Romanians, which they would have. They would not withstand a serious Russian assault. And there are a lot of rumors in Ukraine that Putin is planning one of those for this summer. It's been a year since Poroshenko's government's been in place. They haven't made a lot of progress on fighting corruption, which is what they were supposed to be put in government to do. The army has been in terrible shape because the last government basically robbed the army of its
Ukrainian
resources.
army.
The Ukrainian government, the Yanukovych government, stripped the Ukrainian army of its resources. And again, most Ukrainian generals didn't expect that Russia would be the future enemy. They thought that Russia was their brother, their big brother. So this has been a big wake-up call for a lot of Ukrainians that Russia is not such a nice big brother. And this sort of myth they had of friendship and brotherhood is got to come to an end. So it's led to hardened and ugly feelings on both sides. I've been in Ukraine off and on every other year, and I can just see even the Ukrainians turning more and more anti-Russian and more. And again, most Ukrainians have relations with Russians, family members, including the students I teach in Munich every summer. And it's very hard for them to reconcile their sort of involvement with Russian culture and Russian language with what Putin is doing to their country. But it's become, again.
And the Russian army is not that great. We had Jim Kelsey on, who was a military intelligence guy. They couldn't take that army across the street without it breaking down.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not a great army.
Yeah. I mean,
without the nuclear weapons.
Yeah. And the Chechen wars showed, how limited they were even in their own country against that kind of a war. And there has been a lot of investment in the last couple of years under Putin to improve certain sort of crack forces. So the elite troops that went into Crimea did a fairly good job.
The Spetsnaz and those types of.
But that's not the whole army.
You're right.
And the whole army is still in very bad shape.
They treat them horribly. I mean, those conscripts are
Yeah.
brutalized.
And again, that goes back to the Afghan War too.
Yeah.
I mean, I have one of those books I had my students read is Zinky Boys,
Oh,
a book
that's a
of
tough
memoirs of, and oral histories of soldiers and wives and mothers of soldiers and
Wow.
Soviet soldiers. And it was, bleak, very bleak. They didn't even tell them when they got killed, they send their sons' bodies home in these sealed zinc coffins. They couldn't even see them. And the mothers had to go kidnap them from first Afghanistan and later Chechnya because of the abuse of soldiers.
You know, I mentioned to you.
Literally, excuse me, just a moment, Joe. But literally kidnap their kids out of these conflicts. Is that
there was the most successful civil organization of the Gorbachev era was Mothers of Soviet Soldiers, and they are now back in business with the Ukrainian war.
No kidding.
Because they thought they were finished with the Afghan and Chechen wars, and so the mothers would go negotiate with Chechens who had captured Russian soldiers for their sons' release because the Russian government wouldn't do anything.
Well, the Russian government just treats these kids like they're already dead.
Yeah,
I mean,
more than cannon fodder, or
more than
less
cannon
than
fodder.
cannon.
So I met them. I was in Kharkov, as you recall, and I met the veterans, the Soviet veterans of the war in Afghanistan, and they found out I was a Vietnam vet, and I met them in their office, and they gave me a parachute and some Spetsnaz guys, and but their songs and their gallows humor was the same as the Vietnam veteran, right, who lost the war in Vietnam as they did in Afghanistan. But what a horrible existence they had.
And now there are Afghan veterans fighting on both sides of the conflict there. And again, there too, the Russian government has been relatively, I just read a whole bunch of articles about this problem, so it's fresh in my mind. The Russian government has pretty early on invested money in Afghan veteran sort of recognition and includes the Afghan war in Russian military history and sort of patriotic education, probably in some ways the wrong way. But in Ukraine, it was harder because it was, the army of a state that no longer exists, an army of a state that they are now liberated from. But there are Ukrainian Afghan war veterans who are fighting on the Euromaidan.
Well, they told me, they said when they went to get help, they said that's a Moscow problem, right? And Moscow was, these guys were
So this current government hasn't figured out how to take care of its own veterans either, this Ukrainian government, which is, another thing they have to learn.
But the last thing I would ever think about them was they wanting to go to war. The last thing I would think I was in Kazakhstan, and they didn't want to go to war with anybody. They were destitute. And now you're saying that now these people
but there's money in war, and those people who are fighting even in eastern Ukraine are not doing it for free. Someone's paying them.
So poverty generates war.
Yeah.
Not
just there.
So and that seems to be a common core. And again, I was welcomed as a veteran. There's a brotherhood among veterans. I mean, we've all been there when they. That was a bond that we shared.
And one of my fantasies is to get American Afghan war veterans together with Soviet Afghan war veterans, whether Ukrainian, Russian, Uzbek, whoever.
I wanted to help you with
and
that.
have them to tell each other. I'm sure they could find more in common with each other than Putin and Obama.
Yes,
certainly.
and that was my experience. I could talk to them when they found out I was a veteran, because we've all been to that point. In combat, we were all scared silly, and we came to the oneness of it all, so to speak. That shared denomination among veterans is that we've all faced the ultimate end, and in so doing, you share that experience with everyone else who has been to that point.
And like you say, it's universal.
It is universal.
It doesn't make any difference whether it's an Afghan or Vietnam or Iraq or Chechen.
Well, it's archetypal myths, right? The soldier leaving home to go off to this adventure. We've all shared that. So we share that universally. I did it on Facebook with a Vietnam counterpart.
One of my earliest experience when my oldest Russian friend had a mother who was a decorated World War II veteran in Leningrad. She was a hydraulic engineer, so she went under the ice of Ladoga during the siege of Leningrad to keep it open. She got all kinds of Lenin awards and Stalin awards, and I introduced her to my parents and her husband, who was a war veteran too, but nothing like her.
Yeah.
She was the real hero in the family, and this was back in the perestroika days, I guess. And my father, who was a counterintelligence officer against the Soviets in Vienna during the war, my mother, who was an Austrian-German citizen from the war, they all drank vodka together, kissed, hugged, and I thought, we can overcome this.
We can overcome this. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And I'm Facebooking North Vietnamese, the sons of the soldiers
Yeah,
and some of the
yeah.
soldiers, and it's like we won the war. And I think it must be their Buddhist tradition or something. It was a time that's gone, and
Yeah.
they're now in this time.
Yeah.
More so than me. I don't know.
Well, as Larry Curso aptly pointed out, he says, of course they can be nice and happy. He says they won.
Yeah, there's something about winning. There is that, and
But to your point, though, the universality of the experience, I think, does in fact transcend the particular conflict.
That's what the Russian American student of mine who wrote this West Point graduate who was in my class who wrote this piece about Victory Day. Said he ended it with some army cadence, which he said was what every infantryman would understand, no matter what language it's in, about what you need to do as an infantryman.
Sure.
And he was saying, this universal experience doesn't need translation.
What's off for you for this summer? You're off for the summer. We got about 5 minutes left, and you've got a summer program. You're going to be teaching in.
Yeah, I'm going to be teaching in Munich at something called the Ukrainian Free University, which is itself a product of war. It's founded in 1921 in Vienna by a bunch of Ukrainian intellectuals who were fleeing the Bolsheviks, who were taking over their country and destroying everything that they'd built. And they survived in Prague during the interwar period because the Czech government at that time was very pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian. And then the Soviet army came in 1944 to liberate Prague, and about half the students and faculty had escaped Prague before the Red Army got there. But those who didn't were arrested, deported, and the archives in the library of the university were deported with the NKVD back to Moscow and Kiev, where they still are today. So those who survived went to Munich. And Munich was where the American occupation zone of World War II, after World War II was. So, and there also was a very conservative, by German standards, the Christian Social Union, which was a Catholic Bavarian party, anti-communist, very anti-communist. So the Ukrainians found a patron in this Christian Social Union until about the 90s. And now they have Ukrainian students there who all have degrees from Ukraine, who all have families still in Ukraine, but who've decided for a few years to try to make a go of it in Germany to learn some skills and hopefully go back to Ukraine, depending on what happens in Ukraine. So I'm teaching them their history in history in Ukrainian in Germany. Yeah.
And you're going to be speaking Ukrainian.
I actually tried it in Ukrainian last year and it seemed to work. So,
Mark.
So it's been a kind of amazing experience as an American of German ancestry, teaching in a German Ukrainian university to these Ukrainian kids who want me to tell them whether it's okay to go back.
What is your best guess? How would you think about the future? Where are we in this moment of time? Before we end, what are just some cautionary thoughts of yours about what situation we're in the world right now?
Well, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, I think as long as Putin is probably in power, we're not going to see much of an improvement. But I hope that Russians will understand that having a strong, democratic, peaceful, stable, and prosperous Ukraine will be good for them, and a good example that they can overcome it themselves. And I think there are a lot of Russians who are sympathetic to the Ukrainians, but aren't really allowed to express that these days because it's unpatriotic. I think, I don't like to encourage a lot of my Ukrainian friends to believe that the worse things are for the Russians, the better it is for them, because that's kind of inviting misery that only makes things worse. And
it's really a perspective of zero sum.
Yeah,
you got to win.
It's a Stalinist perspective. The worse, the better.
Yeah.
And I said, you can't. We have to hope for a better Russia if there's going to be a Ukraine in the future, because without Russia improving, Ukraine has no chance. Because we're not going to defend them. The Europeans are not going to defend them. If Putin wants them, he's going to get them.
You would think that Putin having a Ukraine favorable to the West with goods coming, from Kazakhstan and China.
They've tried to present themselves as the bridge between East and West.
And with a declining population in Russia, I mean long term that they're below zero population. They're in a negative growth. So long term, they're not really have much to look forward to.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we've enjoyed our time with Professor Mark Von Hagen, and thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for being a friend of the Veterans Heritage Hour and the Veterans Heritage
It's great to have friends like you.
Well, you're the best. Thank you so much. And David, next week we have Zach Bazzi calling in from Kurdistan.
Yep.
And then we have Rich Carmona, who will be on in June. We have a couple of our VHP students who will also be on in June. Talking about their transformational experience of talking to veterans. So stay tuned to the Veterans Heritage Hour. We'll see you next week.
Can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight